Okay. So basically, my goal for today is to try and introduce a new concept. So, in the same way, right, that sometimes when we make decisions, it's like we're choosing to go somewhere because we think that area is important, right? Or like high ground or something, or we're choosing to wait until someone else uses special to do something, right? Or that we're going to take a fight because I have more range or I have more teammates there or something like that, right? These are all essentially sort of heuristics for in game having a shortcut um, to decide whether you want to do something or not. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
EV Stan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what I'm trying to propose is that there's another way that you can look at the state of the game at any given time to specifically help you decide where to stand and what to do while you're there. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Which I think, to me, I feel like the most intuitive way of thinking about it is kind of like blobby water or something. I don't know. I haven't figured out a good way of describing it, so I'm just going to kind of like walk through my logic about it, and then we can figure out if there's a good way of articulating it. But so the basic idea is this: are we all aware of / agree that getting stuck in a position is kind of bad, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I'd agree.
Right? Because when you get stuck, right, what happens is because you don't have the option to rotate, right, the enemy team basically gets to choose how they want to fight you, or you just have to jump out and give it back to them, right? Whatever space you're trying to take up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, right, it is useful sometimes to think about the map in terms of like a set of areas that are interconnected by choke points, right? And that you can kind of block off or allow flow. And by flow, I mean like literal rotation of players from one location to another.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're aware of that as a general concept, right? Um, and then the other one that might be relevant, I'm not sure if it's really relevant, but I think it might be relevant. Right? We agree that or are aware that attention is a resource, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I see.
And that like it is useful to evaluate or to understand or think about where enemies are paying attention to, right? And specifically to understand that enemy attention is not just like where someone is standing and everywhere that they can attack, but is also very specifically directed in a particular direction, right? And so, I guess the place where I can most justify this being relevant is that um, if someone is stuck paying attention or looking in a particular direction, they don't have as much ability to enforce like control over whatever's behind them. Right? Does that make sense? Vaguely.
Yeah.
EV. Hello.
Sorry, the train is going by. Yeah.
Okay. So with those just general concepts out of the way, just reminding you that exists, right? What I'm trying to say, or what I'm trying to introduce, is that when you're deciding how to play out or a particular position, right? Or how to rotate, or whether it makes sense to be in a flank position or not, and like how you should use the flank position, right? That it is useful to think about, like, at a team level, what sorts of barriers and control are we enforcing? What are they enforcing? And like, how does that interact? And specifically, I would say that when you're pushing or you're holding or you have the advantage, basically, you are thinking about like how to ensure that you enforce like proper uniform control without allowing leakage, which is again where the water analogy comes in. And that when you're retaking, that you are trying to essentially create, either exploit or try and create leaks in the enemy like formation, to stick to the water analogy. Okay, so to kind of illustrate that point, right? I just want to talk about Mahi, if it'll load. Interesting. Wow. Okay. There we go. Thank you. That's not
That's
Mahi.
Scorch.
Yeah. Mahi.
It's funny. It captures like the actual like your mouse and stuff, but it doesn't capture the pop down of each stage.
Right. Okay. So, right, a situation we often find ourselves in is basically that. What does this do? Okay, that's not what I want. You have a highlighter tool? Okay, he doesn't, so I'm just gonna have to draw. Okay, right? So, like, one of us will be, Blop will be not there. Blop is never there. Blop will be here, right? And I'll be like here, and Evie will be somewhere over here, and Stan will be somewhere over here, right? So what I'm trying to say is that whether Stan is here or here matters, right? And that whether Blop is here or here, right, matters. And the reason is, right, if Stan is up here and Blop gets all the way up here, right? Essentially what is happening is that we can kind of contain them into like an area that kind of looks like this, right? Does that vaguely make sense?
Yeah.
And so when we do this, right, then Evie and I can throw bombs, Evie can run in, etc., because they're being corralled into this little space, right? That makes sense? Right?
Yeah.
But, right, importantly, right, I think you remember, Stan, there was a moment where you were here, right? And so we had a formation that kind of looked like this, right? And so really what we have now is we have something that looks like this. Or I think Blop was actually back here. But
it's like I'm forcing them into the left side now.
So specifically what I want you to have in your head is this picture that if you imagine like a mass of water that's here, right? And then Blop were to move up like this, right? What's going to happen is that there are two things. One, weapons that can contest Blop, which is not a lot of people, will try and fight back, right? But the rest of the enemy team is going to kind of naturally just flow this way, right? Does that make sense to me? And what I want you to understand is that you can choose whether you want that to happen or not, right? That, like, them going this way is not strictly a bad thing for us. But you should be aware that that's what's going to happen by choosing to go here, right? Does
I
that make
see.
sense? Yes?
So
That
depending
makes
on
sense to
where
me.
we are positioned,
As a
it
team.
depends.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a team, it may make the enemy team move to a certain position based on where we are at.
Right. And that I think the most intuitive way of thinking about how that's going to happen, right, is to kind of vaguely in your head imagine the enemy team as a collective, as like a blobby mass of water that, when met with resistance, will generally go around it, right?
I see.
Yeah.
Similarly, right, when we're on retake, as a concept for you, suppose we have Blop here, right? And Evie and I don't know, somewhere, right? Something. So when you are zipping, right, we can again think of the enemy team's control as a kind of blobby. We can imagine the enemy team's control as kind of like a blobby mass like this, right?
Yeah.
And specifically, there are people on the enemy team that are enforcing that in this direction, enforcing that here, right? And probably like someone possibly over here enforcing it like this way as well, right? And so if you're gonna zip early, right, you should be trying to specifically create a situation where either this guy has to turn around and look this way, right? Or this guy has to turn around and look this way, right? Because what that does is it changes the dynamic of what the big blob looks like, right? Because then they'll end up kind of with like a hole here, right? From
And now
looking,
shortens the amount of control that they have.
right? And so that's what creates a hole that someone else can use, right? Does that make sense?
And this is based on solely enemy attentions so far.
Yes. It's based on, so this is based on enemy attention. Now, there was also a moment during one of the Mahi games where something like this happened, where we had a bunch of them in mid, right? Like this, right? And I think we were vaguely over here somehow, fighting like this, right? And specifically, we had, ooh, that's new. We had a funky Eevee that managed to wrap around like this, right? So now to bring in that part I was talking about in terms of what's it called? Like the ability to rotate, right? Right now, there is or before Eevee gets there, there is a natural flow or rotation where if faced with enough pressure, the enemy team can just go this way, right? Does that make sense? Eevee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I want you to be thinking about is to envision in the future, right? The situation where you're here, we're here, there's a fight going on, and for whatever reason, the enemy team starts trying to move this way, right? So the reason your position is valuable is basically because you can plug the hole, right? If you
Yeah.
stand around here, you plug the hole. And specifically, the reason you needed to bubble in this situation is because, like,
It's like applying adhesive to the whole plug.
yes, that, like, this is going to be a very strong rushing flow of water if they all decide to turn around, right? So your puny little main weapon by itself is not enough to block the flow of this water, right? So that's why you need the bubble. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But alternatively, right, you can imagine a situation where you're here, they're here, and say we start dying, right? In that case, right, the water is never going to go this way. So you being here to plug the hole, so to speak, isn't actually useful, right? Because you're not doing anything. Like the water wants to go this way anyway, right? It's like blocking the top of a water slide when everyone's already sliding down. Like no one cares, right? So, alternatively, if you don't want to bubble, the other thing you can do to avoid accidentally committing your bubble into a situation where it's no longer useful because of this like flow analogy is that you sit up here and you basically just play in a way where even if they want to go back, because of the way you're playing it with like suction bombs and obnoxious hitboxes, that even without bubble, you can still control them from going this way.
Yeah.
Right? So you either choose to drop or you predict the future that the flow is going to go this way, but that it might also go this way, and then you stay up here and try and basically decide later on what they're actually going to do based on what happens here. Right? But like what I'm trying to say is that during a game, doing this analysis, like the rational analysis of, oh, the enemy team is here. I've been in this situation before. I know that in this specific situation, if XYZ happens, they will rotate this way. I think is less efficient of a logical path than just imagining this is a blob of water. There's like a wall of sand here. And depending on what happens, the water will go this way or this way, right? I feel like
Yeah.
that's it's a shortcut, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense,
Yeah.
Stan?
Yeah.
Okay. So, with that in mind, let's go back to this situation on Barnacle, right? So the situation was this. I think I was like still respawning or something, so I'm back here, right? And I think Stan was here, right? And then Evie and Blop were about to jump in here, basically, right? Which I'll just represent as a single blob.
Who is this
Oh,
against again? Was that this against +1 last night?
No, this was from the
Oh.
tournament, right?
Oh, this situation.
Yeah. Right, the one that you were confused about why I was telling you to do what to do. Okay, so again, we can imagine, right? We essentially have one like kind of blob of water here, and we got some kind of blobby business going on here, right? Meanwhile, enemy team has this and like this. It's just like, wow, okay, that's fancy. That's not what I wanted though. Right? That makes sense? You with me still, Stan?
Yep. Still here.
Okay. So, on an analogy level, right? If we're the flow of water now, because we're retaking, right? So, do you agree in a sense that, right, like the flow of water is most effective if either the enemy team is not expecting it, aka it hits them in the back, right? Or it's like a concentrated flow in a particular direction, right?
Like a jet nozzle.
Yeah. So like or you can think of there's several different ways of retaking, right? Like there's jet nozzle, which is what people do when they like throw all their specials and cooler and just like run it down front, right in front of you, right? That's like one way of doing it, right? Another way is to kind of create like basically a pincer maneuver, which is not really a water analogy, but it is. It requires you to recognize like how around the side you can go, right? which is why there's such a big difference between enemy teams where they put someone here and versus enemy teams where they don't. Because when they don't, right, I think Eevee at this point can recognize when there is a natural path for him to go like this, right? When there is no obstruction of him naturally rotating this way, right?
Yeah.
But by the way, that is the reason you should not be going this way when there's people there, right? Because there is something to block you from just like flowing that way, right? It should not feel, or in your head, you should be able to envision essentially there being something blocking the flow of water in that direction, right? Anyway, so going back to the example of Stan, right?
Yeah.
You chose to go this way, right? Now I'm going to draw a slightly different set of blobs. This is you. This is what you've given the enemy. Here,
And now I'm stuck.
Here's Blob and Eevee. And this blob. Do you see how that's like, does this like visually look worse to you than the alternative where like you're here and the blobs kind of look like this, right? Because even if they're up all the way here, right? Do you see how that like maybe that's a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is the picture I'm trying to get you guys to see while you are playing a match. Is to be able to envision kind of what we're doing in this blobby sense and to understand what the enemy is doing in the same blobby sense and yes, it's like kind of a wishy-washy way, but this is when I like make calls about how we should be flanking or playing certain positions. This is kind of the picture I have in my head, right? Because you don't have time to rationalize about all the details during an actual match. You just have to kind of rely on either concrete opportunities in front of you or like vague intuition about how to play the position, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I see.
And so like when I'm deciding if I'm too far forward or if like someone should be staying in a flank position or not or whatever, I have in my head a sense of like how solid the particular blobs are and whether I think like they will hold up or if like they're useful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.